we're going to now shift into a panel mode, which Dr. Cullum is going to organize, where we're going to have several of the panelists will answer any questions that people have that haven't already been answered during their individual presentations. I want to thank all of you for attending the conference today. This ends the formal part of the conference. We'll have some Q&A for about 15 to 20 minutes. And we will be posting these talks and slide decks on the UT Southwestern website sometime within the next few weeks. So those who are interested, follow our Twitter handle, UT Southwestern Psychiatry, or the O'Donnell Brain Institute handle on Twitter, UT Southwestern Brain Institute, and you'll see when those come up. When those who are unable to hear the entire presentation or who missed the conference and want to hear it, we certainly would welcome your input. If you enjoyed the conference, feel free to reach out to the speakers and let them know. I again want to give special thanks to all of our speakers from UT Southwestern, to Dr. Staub, to Dr. Giordano, and to our other guests who kind of gave us the 30,000-foot view of the national security implications of Havana Syndrome, to Suzanne Kelly, Dan Hoffman, Greg Meyer, and Mark Polymeropoulos for sharing his own personal story of how he experienced Havana Syndrome and the advocacy work that he's done. So with that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Cullum. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you all for being here, and thank for our panelists who are remaining. I know some people had to jump off, so not everyone is here. I have some questions I've collected throughout the chat throughout the day. They've been quite extensive. I've tried to cull through them as much as possible. And some are to the panel in general, and others are directed to some of the individuals here. So I will just start with one of the general, I guess, panel question. This might be in Dr. Giordano's area a little bit more, but are you aware of any support available to individuals who have collected evidence that they likely have been subjected to directed energy forces? How would you advise these people to handle their collection of this information?
That's a really good question. There are a number of different avenues that one could pursue. One clearly would be to have one's attending physician either contact one of the individuals here, for example, and me inclusive, and or to contact Walter Reed National Medical Center. Clearly, as you know, the Walter Reed Medical Center was one of the central depositories and repositories for treating those individuals with the prototypic cases. And referral to Walter Reed might be an important venue, but that would have to be a physician-based referral. So again, I think it's very important to have, if you will, the clinical advocacy that the individual who's been affected is considered to be representative and therefore requires some verification and validation. And that would really get the wheels rolling. I hope that answers your question. Great,
I hope so as well. Dr. Staub, your model of illness as overlapping Venn diagrams piqued some people's interest. Sounds like a network analysis type of approach. Is your group exploring statistical ways of analyzing these collected data?
So that's a great question. The answer is yes. We have started with some really first generation AI tools to try and get at some of this. I mean, AI really, it is just a technology to allow us to see patterns that we couldn't otherwise see. It's going to take some time to develop that, and it's also important that there are limits to what AI can do, and that based on what data we can provide it. So the process is going to be sort of what we think now, test it, see whether or not that's right, and kind of retest it. But yes, those processes are getting started.
That's terrific. I also understand that for those types of analyses, you need actually really large numbers. So that'll be an ongoing thing for a while.
Yeah, that it's yes and no. It depends on the kind of question that you're asking. So if some questions can be asked with data sets in the hundreds, but those are relatively simple, straightforward, but still kind of intriguing questions. So we don't have to say, oh my goodness, we can't do anything until we see 1 million patients. If we see a couple of hundred to a few thousand, there are certain questions that AI can help us answer.
Terrific. So this to the, I guess, to the mainly to the physicians on the panel. When tinnitus occurs, how often do you find that you can actually infer an etiology? And what percentage of cases are just spontaneous? Just people walking around and suddenly they have this experience in the absence of any suspected exposure to anything?
I'll take that question, Dr. Cullum. I've seen a number of the patients that I've seen that have PPPD and vestibular migraine also have associated tinnitus. And sometimes it's related to the syndrome presentation, but there have been other cases where the patients have said, oh, I've had tinnitus for many years, but it didn't bother me and it's become worse. And I try to use Dr. Kutz's approach that he mentioned in his talk this morning, which is to think of tinnitus not really as being an otologic illness, but really the brain kind of tricking the patient. But it can be a very disabling symptom for patients, and in severe cases has to be taken very seriously because it's associated with a higher incidence of suicidal ideation and frank hopelessness. One of the fortunate things we found that helps tinnitus sufferers is low-dose benzodiazepine medications are often helpful, not because they make the tinnitus go away, but they somehow help the brain reframe how it perceives it. And the other thing that many sufferers of tinnitus have found very helpful is an app developed by a tinnitus sufferer in the UK. It's called Quietin, like the word quiet, E-N. And I've had tinnitus patients who told me about the app, which I share with my other patients, and they found it very, very helpful.
Great. This may be a question more for Dr. Lane or Dr. Lakritz or Dr. Well, actually several of you, but some patients with these unexplained symptoms don't feel like their doctors believe them. How do you handle that? How do you advise patients to approach their healthcare providers to address these issues so that they will feel listened to? That's a tough one, I know.
Thank you for asking that question. And this is something in my clinic that I hear from patients who may have gone to several providers or other contexts before making it to a neuropsychiatry clinic, where this is not an uncommon experience. And I don't know if there's a magic sentence or a magic word. In fact, I imagine there's not, to be able to walk into an appointment and avoid those moments, those unfair and undeserved moments where someone isn't feeling heard. But I think if I were to have any advice around this question, it would be to try to communicate to your provider the suffering that you're living with, to communicate to your provider how this is impacting your life and keeping you from living the quality of life that you want and that we know you deserve. And hopefully that will be able to, if not, allow the provider to think about what diagnoses it could be, or the causes of the syndrome that you might be living with. At least it reminds your provider of the humanity of why you're in their office, why you're in their clinic. And that might be able to tap into a common page, a shared page where you can work together on that.
Anything else to add to that? I think that's a nice response.
I'll chime in as an ethicist. I mean, I think it's important to remember that the nature of the clinical encounter is an asymmetrical one. If the patient could diagnose or treat themselves, they wouldn't be there. And so it's a question of need, which then goes back to that humanitarian encounter of an individual who professes to be able to assess and then intervene, and the individual who needs that. And that level of intervention may not be cure, and very often it's not, but at very, very least, it should approach some level of healing. So the idea is cure when capable, treat as best possible, but care always, which I think really bespeaks what Dr. Lane has said.
Can I jump in here just for one quick second as one of the someone who's experienced this? It was, one of the most kind of disheartening times. It was in 2018 when I was seeing multiple doctors all over the Northern Virginia area and having to explain over and over again what happened. I think, and so finally, when I finally got to Walter Reed and I found an institution that actually believed me, that was extraordinary. But I think one of the key things is kind of, it's just patient knowledge that there are places like, and everyone here is representative of an institution that actually is treating this and believes in it. And so there has to be, awareness on the part of those who need to be treated to go to the right place, because there is nothing worse. I saw so many different doctors, even to the point where, I had a vertigo episode about 2 months ago. And I remember being on the phone with Walter Reed, and they told me to get to, Fairfax Hospital, and trying to explain this to the emergency room, what was happening. Literally, it was to the point where actually I elected not to. I didn't tell them anything about direct, Havana Syndrome, AHIs, any of that. It was more of, am I having a stroke and dying right now? I need a CT scan, because Walter Reed gave me the instructions. You need a CT scan. That's it. So that it is so incredibly frustrating for patients if you especially kind of in the introduction to new doctors. But the point is that there are so many more people out there, like everyone on this panel, who is treating this. So there are so many more options, and that is critical. When people call me and they say, where should I go? There are many more options than there were several years ago. And so that's a really good thing, because there's nothing worse than not being believed, or even kind of that arched eyebrow, or rolling in with a big stack of medical files, for very rushed and hurried medical staff. So I commend all you for kind of being involved in this, but I think it's getting the education out that there are people who can treat this.
Yeah, let me add something to that, because again, one of the hats I wear is as one of the senior bioethicists to an organization called the DMEC, which is the Defense Medical Ethics Center out of Walter Reed. And an important consideration is exactly as Mark has said. Number one, it's getting to the right clinicians to understand this, and I think that's critical. The other thing is that there's been a tremendous amount of miscommunication about this thing called Havana Syndrome, and the fact that there is an ongoing discourse, a dialogue about psychogenic and sociogenic effects tends to sort of devolve everything down to that as a final common denominator. I think what's very important to get out there is that there are notable cases that are in a verification and validation pipeline that represent something other than a sociogenic and a psychogenic effect. It becomes critically important. I mean, the first step in medicine is what is wrong with this patient, then what can be done, and then what should be done. Practical question is, can you really do what you should? But I think it also is critical, as Dr. Staub and others have said, is to understand what is the constellation that would represent sociogenic and psychogenic effects, as well as possible psychological overlay. But to also understand that there's something really here that doesn't rule out that there are psychogenic and sociogenic effects. There are. It doesn't rule out that individuals have pre-existing or coexisting conditions that have many of the same signs and symptoms that may be conflated. There are. But it's equally important to understand that there's something here, and we need to get a much clearer clinical picture of that, if nothing else epidemiologically, to understand the magnitude of the effect, as well as to understand how to best approach it. So Mark, the point is very, very well taken.
And one of the things that I would add is this may not help people as they approach the sort of the first interaction with their physicians or other clinicians, but we try to help people re-engage with their home docs when they come to see us in the following way. I say to patients, I apologize for not on behalf of their doctor, but I say, look, I bet your home clinicians were trained the same way I was in this old model. If it's either in a laboratory test or it's all in your head, that's the way we were trained. That's the way we thought back then. It wasn't right. We know that now. And so let's see if we can help you kind of recognize that that's when your doctor, your nurse practitioner, whoever the clinician may be, was trained. But let's see if we can't kind of break through a little bit and kind of overcome that. And that usually, because most people, like Mark described, have been through that process, and by the time they do get to us, it's become such a sore point that trying to take a little bit of that pain away and explain that, hey, this is about all of us who were trained in the 20th century. We all got to move forward. And when I say to patients, it's changing, but not change ed, that kind of clicks a little bit with them to try and so that they can work with the home docs a bit.
That actually, I think, nicely addressed a couple of other questions that relate to that, which is sort of, how do we get the word out? How do we educate the new generation of physician and healthcare providers? And is this group interested in doing any sort of information pamphlet? I'll take that up with the group later, but I think that was a good response. As far as risks to the developing brain, why don't we hear more about kids being affected? Are the numbers just too small of the kids being in these environments? Or we know in concussion that child brains tend to be more vulnerable to the effects of concussion. They may take longer to recover. What about it in this condition? Anybody or everybody on that one?
Let me give you a national security perspective. One of the questions I saw pop up in the chat referred to intent. Certainly above my pay grade and out of my sandbox with regard to attribution and potential intent. But the overall intent in utilizing these most sophisticated devices in these ways, I think really harkens back to a very, very literal definition of a weapon. In other words, it's means of contending against others in ways that are disruptive. It doesn't need to be destructive, disruptive. The disruptions can occur on a variety of levels. It can be physical disruption, social disruption, psychological disruption, economic disruption. And essentially what that does is that creates rippling effects. So it becomes important to think, well, what are valuable targets, sites, loci, and foci for disruptive effects? And I think if we examine some of the individuals who are prototypically affected in Havana, that answer becomes pretty obvious. But I think the larger issue is that there's the need for increased vigilance, preparedness, and understanding that a variety of tools and techniques, technologies, and science could be rendered more generally against the public, inclusive of those we hold near and dear, kin and kith, children inclusive, to have disruptive effects, not necessarily in the short term, but in the intermediate and long term. And as Dr. Staub said, what that then calls forth is the need to increase education and training to be just aware of what's, quote, out there. I mean, let's face it, before microbe theory, we were talking about miasma, and then everything changed. Well, this isn't exactly a sea change, but it is really, I think, a call to remain aware and apace with what the science and technology can do and how it might be misused in those ways that are nefarious.
Dr. Cullum, I would add a bit of a positive note about younger children anyway, in two regards. And I'm not trying to be Pollyannish about this, but rather bring some information that we know about functional disorders and about trauma for younger children. Persistent functional syndromes, to the extent that any element of this is functional, persistent functional syndromes are less common in young children than they are in adolescents and adults. They have lots of transient ones. Any kid who's run off in first grade to, with a tummy ache because they're scared of school, has a functional syndrome. But persistent ones are less common in young children. And second is that young children look to their home environment largely for the recovery period. So if they have a secure home environment after a traumatic experience, the likelihood that they'll go on to persistent traumatic stress related kinds of problems is less. Once kids get into adolescence and begin to have their home environment be less important to them than their peer environment, they lose a little bit of that protection. So I think that's not to say that young children are invulnerable to this from a biological standpoint, but that the psychological social factors are more in their favor than perhaps teenagers or young adults.
Good answer. Another question was, has anyone tried to study civilians who feel they may have been suffering from similar symptoms or exposed to such conditions? Anything in the literature that anybody's aware of along those lines?
Yeah, there's evidence coming from some of the international literature for individuals who've been exposed to various forms of rangeable and non-rangeable acoustic stimuli, both in the auditory range as well as the ultrasonic range. Certainly, we know there's a lot of work having been done on the Fry effect, and there is a body of literature, both international and some of it domestic, with regard to the effects of scalable, pulsable microwaves that exist below the thermal artifact level.
Is anyone aware of any movement toward funding opportunities for research in this area? Or is the DoD interested in this? NIH talking about funding ongoing projects in addition to the one NIH funding that was mentioned earlier?
Well, I think, let me just start the conversation. I think it's important and noteworthy that the current administration has allocated $33 million towards the overarching construct and consideration of what we're calling Havana Syndrome, and that money has a number of different silos, inclusive of a research and development silo that could be utilized for things like detection and mitigation.
I can add to that, Dr. Cullum, as well. I think with the creation of ARPA for Health, we'll see more monies looking at these type of complex illnesses, whether they're neuroscience type of conditions or pandemics, future pandemics. I think one of the things that has been highlighted by Dr. Giordano and Dr. Staub is that from DARPA's point of view and the government's point of view, i.e. an ARPA Health, the biggest threats to our workforce in these spaces, the military, the diplomats, as Ambassador Rubin pointed out, and as Mark Polymeropoulos and Dan Hoffman pointed out, to our intelligence community overseas, and to our country here, vis-a-vis the pandemic, are these types of 21st century challenges. So I think this is all very brand new and was codified in last year by President Biden. And it's just starting now. There's still decisions being made that just recently that ARPA Health will likely be housed in the Department of Health and Human Services rather than NIH. But I think we will see more in that regard. While I have the mic, I have a question for Dr. Giordano and Dr. Staub. There's been a lot of, both of you mentioned the role of the insular cortex, and Dr. Marty Paulus at the Laureate Institute in Tulsa has done a lot of work with his colleagues on this, looking at, there were published papers looking at special forces soldiers and the different types of stressful training they had. And they showed on functional MRI changes in the insular cortex and its activation or deactivation. Could you comment on that? And do you think that might have applicability, that whole idea of interoception, of how the brain maps its external experience onto the insular cortex?
I'll start and then I'll hand it over to you, Jeff, if I could. On the basic science or on the translational science side, I think that caution needs to be taken when examining, for example, structural changes in brain with what might be ecological inputs. In other words, to say that the insula changes in some way or that the amygdala changes in some way. Well, that's sort of a non-directional change. What does change in size or change in particular densities of cells and or what's called dendritic ratios mean? But I think it is important to understand that those changes, particularly if those changes represent an acute or subacute change, also may represent a certain level of plasticity. So to demonstrate that an ecological event, an environmental event, whether it's in training or with some experience, then induces that level of structural effect that may have some functional correlates. I think that's the real challenge, is to be able to say, all right, we have these things that occur in this individual's environment, education, training, experience. We see that there are sort of these pre versus post changes with regard to a baseline in various what's called regions of interest or areas of interest in the brain. And then the question is, well, what does that mean? What does that mean in terms of neurological functional effects? And then how do those changes in neurological network activity translate into viable changes in cognition, emotionality, or behaviors, which then clearly then gets us into the intersectional translational clinical realm. Jeff, over to you, sir.
Yeah, I would just follow up on that, Jim, and it is that you know, the very interesting sort of semi-famous study done on London black cab drivers a few years ago, showing that they had larger hippocampi than the average person. Now, to become in the old days, London before, you know, back before GPS and so forth, to get licensed as a London cab driver, you had to know the city map by rote and pass a test. And so there was great memorization of geographic that was required for that job, and it showed up as an increase in hippocampal volumes. And so going from a function and a focus of a function on an area of the brain and basically exercising that area of the brain led to a change in its structure. And so functional changes can beget structural changes in a positive, not just negative way. The second thing I would say about the insula is it's very important to know what parts of the insula. The insula from posterior to anterior moves from sort of sensory processing to spatial processing to a sensory emotional integration in a relatively small area. So it's important to know where and then to have those functional and symptom correlates.
Earlier today, the issue of control groups has come up for research in this area. What are people's thoughts about who would be some of the best control groups? What other populations do we really need to compare this population to get at the answers that we think we need?
I'll start that one first, Dr. Cullum. I think that, there were a couple of people today who offered populations that have overlapping symptoms. So I think the first question that we have to ask is, what aspect of this are we trying to test? Because if we're trying to test for perpetuating factors that may be in the psychological, social, environmental realm, then thinking about patients who are developing long COVID, patients who had Gulf War syndrome, patients who have persistent, post mild concussive syndromes, they may be good comparisons because there are some of those overlapping kinds of problems. But if we're looking at something that's more etiologic in terms of the original insult, then we have to be a little, then mixing those kind of groups wouldn't necessarily get at the kind of problems that we want. So I think the first question is, what question are we asking? Is there an active illness group that overlaps, but we think may have unique aspects, and then a normal population? So normal active illness that reflects the question being answered or asked rather, and then the population, the Havana population of interest.
Good answer. I'll ask. Go ahead.
Also add to that, when I worked overseas as a regional psychiatrist and medical officer, part of what we would do, all of the medical people and psychiatrists would do, is give talks to the embassy communities about health hazards and stressors overseas. And I'll never forget, I got asked this question all the time, and Ambassador Rubin touched on it in his fine talk, which is, we take a group of people who are typically in their early to late 20s, and they join the diplomatic corps as specialists or as generalists, and they typically serve for 20 years in mostly difficult and challenging and even dangerous environments. And the question I would get asked by a first tour person overseas is, I'm going to be overseas for 20 years. Is this bad for my health? I always got asked that question. So I think in terms of a control group, what is needed is a larger population-based study where you take a class of entering diplomats. It's going to be about 100 to 200 people, and you follow them out. And you would have to have an academic center that would manage the study. Sort of think of it as the grant study, but for diplomats. And the other thing I wanted to point out for the panelists and our listeners is the GAO is just recently, they're going to have congressional subcommittee hearings on the overseas mental health of our diplomats and exactly these type of questions and what can be done. So those would be the control groups. The other question that is implicit in this, really for Dr. Giordano, is we know that these places such as Havana are very stressful places to live and work. Moscow, where I spent 5 years, is very stressful. Other war zones that Mark Polymeropoulos served in, a lot of stressors are put on the health of our diplomatic personnel and their families overseas. So what's peculiar is these stressors are enduring and have been around for decades. So why did we only see this now in 2016 and onwards? And maybe Dr. Giordano can comment about that.
Yeah, we gave a series of briefings to our colleagues in the Department of State, particularly as regards to their services for health, well-being, and medical oversight of individuals who are going to be deployed OCONUS outside the continental United States. And one of their concerns was exactly as you've said. I mean, that the sort of the standard was to brief individuals and prepare individuals for what would be considered, if you will, run-of-the-mill burdens, risks, and harms, local disease threats, the sort of issues that go on with sort of the socio-cultural issues with the general population, sort of the average thing you would tend to see with preventative or occupational medicine with those types of deployment. But I think one of the things that was conspicuously absent is an awareness that the current sophistication of the science and technology could be utilized in those ways that presented potential harms and threats to individuals who might be so deployed. And that was one of the points that was drilled home for us. In other words, look, given the increasing sophistication and capability of these various things and their viability for dual use, shouldn't this be in the repertoire of things that we're at least briefed about and understand that there may be the possibility, if not risk and threat, of being exposed in these ways? So number one, what can be done to detect it? Number two, what can be done to treat it? And number three, what could be done to mitigate it or prevent it? And the answer to the question is, yeah, you're absolutely right. But I'll go one step further. It's not just a question of individuals who are deployed overseas. Yeah, I mean, clearly they represent probably the low-hanging fruit in the first tier of perhaps viably affected individuals who may be in harm's way. But the accessibility of the science and technology, inclusive, I must say, of the possibility for do-it-yourself. Not to say that the do-it-yourself community is in any way capricious or nefarious, but the fact that these types of technologies, number one, are out there. Number two, that if you will, the instructions to create such a thing might also be out there. For example, extant patents that might then be corruptible or used. Number three, that there may be not only nation states, but individual actors, either as proxies or independently, that might see this as an opportunity. I think also makes it very, very important, as others have said, that there's an increased awareness among the medical community of at least the viability of these types of things to pose from harm, if not risk, and what the actual threat risk might be, like anything else.
A couple last questions, maybe to Doctors Lane and Lakritz. Thoughts about the role of A, neuropsychology, and B, neuropsychiatry and neuroimaging in study designs in this area moving forward? What would be scalable and deployable also?
I think we have some models for this type of team science approach in a number of disorders. And in fact, even thinking back to an earlier question about how to work with your physician, the first thought that came to my mind is that you need a team and that where people are working together, but also addressing different aspects of an issue. So I see a clear role there, particularly given the role of, or the report of some of the cognitive difficulties, particularly related to attention, which we know can affect other cognitive areas, that would be a really nice piece to have of a more comprehensive study from that regard.
I completely agree with Dr. Lakritz there. And the only thing I would add is that the best science comes from a team that includes people who are working very closely with their patients. Be they neuropsychologists, neuropsychiatrists, neurologists, what have you, is to have someone or someones on a team designing a project and following it through and thinking about what are the questions we need to ask, what are the skills we need to collect, what are the biomarkers we're interested in. And those processes are best informed when you have clinicians who are in the office, in the hospital, side by side with patients and hearing about their lived experiences. I find that those are the moments that really inform sound clinical research.
I want to thank Dr. Dekleva before I turn the mic back to him for organizing this, because I found it extremely interesting and valuable. We still have well over 100 people, and it's nearing the end of the day. So I think that's really impressive. So I'm going to turn it back to you, Dr. D.
Thank you, Dr. Cullum. A question that I have really for several of the other clinicians on the panel, Dr. Giordano, Dr. Lane, Dr. Lakritz, Dr. Cullum, and Dr. Staub, is we've all seen patients with severe symptom presentations of these neurological, neurovestibular, neuropsychiatric disorders who've been to many, many specialists, often in many different medical centers. We've had many patients, Dr. Staub, that say, I've been to Mayo, to your clinic and other clinics. They're really yearning and searching for answers, as Dr. Lane has said, to very difficult problems. But we've also seen patients who have moderate to severe symptoms that are crippling and disabling, and then suddenly, unexplainably get well. Do any of our other panelists want to comment on that? I find that amazing. I'm grateful for the patient when I see it. And sometimes they get well after a long period of time. So you can't attribute it to a medication. They've been on, let's say, an SSRI or SNRI for several years, and it didn't really work. And then suddenly they're better. They've had different types of therapies, vestibular, cognitive rehabilitation, and cognitive behavioral therapies. Nothing really worked for a long time. And then the patient got well. Is this spontaneous remission? Is it neuroplasticity? How do we explain this mystery that we often see?
Ken, that's a great question. I'm going to take just a very tentative stab at it. One of the things that I'm working with a wonderful group at the University of Pittsburgh is about beliefs and behaviors. And especially with respect to rehabilitation. And this work comes from back pain and rehabilitation there. And it gets at what patients, the convictions that they have about their illness and their outcomes. And things like, I can't do this if I'm still dizzy, or I can't do this if I can't think. And on a couple of occasions, I've seen people who, for whatever reason, they had to adopt a role that required them to think differently about their illness state, and they just were able to step up and do it. So a family demand, something like that. So I think that there's an area that we really have not studied well in medicine, psychiatry, psychology, neurology, about what human beings believe that they bring to their illness state and how that affects their outcomes. And I don't mean believe in a bad way. I'll give you an example. A very simple one of a patient who came and said, I can't go back to work until I'm not dizzy. And I said, well, why not? And they said, because the boss told me, don't come back until you're not dizzy. So I can't work until I'm not dizzy. That was a belief that wasn't nefarious in any way. His boss told him that. And so basically it took a lot of work for us to get that person to even conceptualize doing things with partial symptoms because of the mindset that he brought. So I think beliefs, and again, not to cast aspersions on patients to use that, but human beliefs make a difference that we don't understand very well.
Well, let me add something to that if I could. This comes from somebody who I hold as very, very wise, certainly much smarter than me. One of my adult life mentors, Professor Edmund Pellegrino from Georgetown, a physician for 70 plus years at the bedside. And one of the stories that Ed used to like to tell sort of related to the person who's looking for their car keys. And they always say, well, I found them in the last place I looked. Yeah, exactly right. He said, very often that's the approach that we need to appreciate with clinical intervention. You need to try a variety of different things. What works, what doesn't, in whom and why. And very often it's the last thing that works, as the car key analogy. It's also, in some cases, a question of iterative effects that can occur that ultimately reach some, I hate to use the word tipping point, but sort of reset, if you will, the physiologic threshold to then prompt some kind of recovery, or at least recuperation and function that's accessible and therefore amenable to the patient. So part of that, I think the take-home message there is keep trying, and a variety of different approaches. Because like so many other things, you know, you don't keep looking in the same place for your keys. You look other places.
I think we'll end on that lovely note by Dr. Giordano. We started this conference on Havana Syndrome, the first such conference held in an academic biomedical center in the United States that's open to all, by talking about patients. We spent most of the morning talking about clinical approaches to patients, real patients that we see here at UT Southwestern Medical Center under the rubric of the Peter O'Donnell Brain Institute. We then let Dan Hoffman and Mark Polymeropoulos and Ambassador Rubin kind of take us out of the clinic and look at the national security ramifications of Havana Syndrome from the 30,000 foot level, at the level of the Pentagon, the CIA, the State Department, and really indirectly even the White House. And then I want to thank Dr. Staub and Dr. Giordano for kind of bridging that and bringing us back to end this discussion, talking about patient care and the joys that patient care brings us, and that we look to a combination of curiosity and compassion, and as Dr. Giordano has said, ethics to help our patients. I want to thank all of you for attending. I want to give a special thank to all of our panelists and all of our guests. And for the guests, feel free to reach out to us. And these talks will be posted in the next couple of weeks on the UT Southwestern website. Thank you very much.
Thank you all.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.